I was sorting invoices at the long table when my sister's phone lit up beside my elbow, the glow sharp enough to pull my eyes away before I meant to look. A transfer alert filled the screen. More money than I had ever seen land in my account at one time. The kind of number that makes your breath catch, even when it does not belong to you. My sister glanced down, smiled slowly, and turned the phone just enough so our mother could see. She said the payment came through fast and thanked her. I asked what it was for, the question slipping out before I could stop it. My mother did not hesitate. She waved her hand and said, "Of course she paid my sister. It was professional work." Then she looked at me and said that family works for free. My sister leaned back, pleased, while the notification still glowed between us. I felt something inside me close. I set the papers down, stood up, and left without a word. I did not know it yet, but that was the last quiet moment of my old life. I stepped outside into the evening air and let the door close behind me. The sound was soft, but it felt final. The parking lot was nearly empty, the sky already turning the pale blue that comes just before night settles in. I walked to my car on instinct, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. I did not cry. That surprised me. I had cried over smaller things, missed birthdays, long hours, thank yous that never came. This felt different. It felt clean, like a line drawn with a ruler. I sat behind the wheel and breathed until my heart slowed, until the words "family works for free" stopped echoing quite so loudly in my head. I drove home without turning on the radio. The quiet pressed in, giving my thoughts too much room. I replayed the moment again and again, the ease with which my mother said it, the way my sister did not even pretend to be uncomfortable. They had not argued about whether to pay her. There had been no discussion, no weighing of options. It was decided, obvious, settled. The only question had been why I was surprised. I had been working for the family business since my early 20s. I was 29 now. I told people I helped out. That was the word everyone used, as if I floated in and out when I felt like it. The truth was that I ran the parts no one wanted to see. I handled schedules, client follow-ups, supplier calls, last-minute problems that always seemed to land in my lap. When something broke, or a deal nearly fell apart, I was the one called in to smooth it over. I knew the systems, the personalities, the weak spots. I knew which promises could bend and which would snap. My sister, on the other hand, came in with ideas and presentations. She spoke the language my mother liked: growth and image and visibility. She was polished, confident, and always busy somewhere else. When she showed up, it was an event. When she left, people noticed. When I stayed late, it was expected. That night, I walked into my apartment and dropped my bag by the door. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually comforted me after a long day. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring at nothing. I told myself not to overreact. Families were complicated. Money made things weird. I had heard all the excuses before: experience, exposure, legacy. I had accepted them because I believed we were building something together. But the sentence would not leave me alone. Family works for free. It was not said with guilt or apology. It was said like policy, like gravity. In that moment, I realized it had always been the policy. I just had not seen it clearly until money lit up my sister's screen and cast the rest of us in shadow. The next morning, I went back to work as usual. I arrived early, unlocked the doors, turned on the lights. Muscle memory carried me through the motions. On the surface, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt different. Every task came with a quiet question attached. Why was this mine? Who benefited from this? What would happen if I stopped? My sister came in late, heels clicking across the floor. She greeted everyone brightly as if the night before had been nothing. When she passed me, she asked if I had left in a hurry and said she hoped I was not upset. Her tone was light, almost teasing. I told her I was fine. It was easier than explaining something she already knew. Throughout the day, I noticed things I had never named before. How decisions were made without me even when they affected my workload. How my mother spoke about my sister contributions as investments, while mine were described as help. How praise flowed in one direction and instructions in another. It was not that they were cruel. That almost made it worse. They were comfortable. At lunch, I sat alone and ate quickly, watching people move around me. I thought about all the times I had defended this setup to friends who asked why I did not get paid properly. I said it was complicated. I said it would even out. I said I was lucky to be part of something meaningful. I wondered when I had started confusing meaning with obligation. That afternoon, a client called with a problem only I knew how to fix. I handled it smoothly, like always. When I hung up, I felt a strange distance from my own competence. This was valuable. I knew it was. They knew it was too. They just did not think it needed to be acknowledged. When the day finally ended, I did not stay late. That alone felt like a small rebellion. I shut down my computer, gathered my things, and left at a reasonable hour. In the car, I laughed softly at myself. It was not revenge. It was not even a plan. It was simply a refusal to pretend nothing had happened. That evening, I sat on my couch and let my thoughts settle. I did not call anyone. I did not confront my mother or my sister. I knew how that conversation would go. They would tell me I was being emotional. They would remind me of everything they had given me. They would say no one was forcing me to stay. And maybe they would be right. But something inside me was no longer willing to accept the story they told about my place in this family. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen. For years, I had trusted that fairness would arrive on its own if I worked hard enough and loved enough. That belief felt naive now. I did not know what I would do next. I only knew I could not unsee what I had seen. The payment on my sister's phone had been more than money. It had been a mirror. I closed the laptop without typing anything and stood up. Tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not. For the first time, I felt the weight of choice pressing back. I went to bed knowing one thing for certain. I would never hear that sentence the same way again, and whatever came next would not be quiet. The morning after that payment landed on my sister's phone, I arrived before anyone else and stood in the doorway longer than usual, letting the building wake up around me. The lights hummed softly as I flipped them on one by one, the smell of cleaner lingering from the night crew. This place had always felt like an extension of my own body, familiar down to the smallest creak in the floor. That morning, it felt like someone else's house, not hostile, just not mine. I set my bag down and went straight to work, answering emails, updating schedules, checking the list of tasks I had left unfinished the night before. Nothing on the surface had changed. The same names, the same deadlines, the same expectations waiting quietly for me to meet them. Inside, though, something had shifted. It was like I had been handed a map I did not know existed, and now every step I took landed differently. People started filtering in, greeting me the way they always did, with easy smiles and casual questions. I smiled back, my face doing what it had been trained to do. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how often decisions were announced after they had already been made, how often my role was to execute rather than weigh in. I had known this before, in a vague way. Now it felt precise. My mother arrived mid-morning, her energy brisk and purposeful. She moved through the space with the confidence of someone who believed everything was exactly where it should be. She asked me about a delivery that had been delayed and whether I could smooth things over with the vendor. I said I would handle it. She nodded, already turning away, trusting that I would do what I always did. A little later, my sister came in, perfectly put together, coffee in hand. She asked how things were going, her tone light, as if we had not shared that moment the night before. I told her things were busy. She smiled and said, busy was good. It meant we were growing. I watched her walk into my mother's office without knocking, the door closing softly behind her. They stayed in there longer than usual. While they talked, I handled the floor. I fielded questions, fixed a minor problem that could have escalated if left alone, reassured a client who needed more than the standard response. I moved from one thing to the next, the way I always had, but now I was counting. Not hours or tasks. Something else. The quiet assumptions stacked around me like invisible weight. When my sister finally emerged, she had that look she always wore after those meetings, energized, satisfied. She passed by me and said she had a great idea she wanted to roll out soon, something strategic. She said it casually, as if ideas were the same as outcomes. I nodded. I had learned long ago that my ideas sounded different once they passed through her mouth. At lunchtime, I sat at my desk instead of joining the others. I ate quickly, scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything. My mind kept circling the same question. When had the rules been written? Not just about money, but about value, about who got to be seen as essential and who was simply reliable. I thought back to earlier years, moments I had brushed off at the time. The first time my sister was paid for a project while I was thanked for helping out. The way my mother spoke about her work as professional and mine as natural, like breathing. I remembered how proud I had felt when my mother told people I was the heart of the business. At the time, it sounded like praise. Now, it sounded like a role assignment. That afternoon, my mother called me into her office. She wanted to go over a few things, adjustments she and my sister had discussed. I listened, taking notes, nodding. At one point, I asked a simple question about whether we were going to formalize some of my responsibilities, maybe put them in writing. Not a demand. Just a question. She looked at me over her glasses and smiled in a way that was meant to soften the answer. She said we did not need to complicate things, that we were family. That flexibility was our strength. She reminded me how much she trusted me, how important I was. The words were warm. The meaning underneath them was not. I thanked her and left the office. My hands were steady. My chest felt tight. It struck me then how easily concern could be used to deflect responsibility. How care could be framed in a way that kept the balance exactly where it had always been. Later, a client stopped me in the hallway to say how much she appreciated my help. She said she did not know what they would do without me, that I seemed to be everywhere at once. I smiled and told her it was my job. The word caught in my throat. Job. It sounded strange, almost dishonest, given how rarely that word was used when it came to me. As the day wore on, I noticed how often my sister name came up in conversations about growth and direction, even when she was not there. How often my name was mentioned only in relation to tasks, logistics, things that needed to be done. It was not malicious. That was the hardest part. It was simply the way the system worked. On my drive home, I replayed my mother's answer in my head. Family, flexibility, trust. Words that had always made me feel safe now felt like walls. I realized how often I had accepted explanations because they sounded loving, even when they cost me something. I had told myself that caring more meant asking for less. I had been wrong. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I did not have a plan. I was not plotting anything dramatic. I just wanted to see things clearly. I started listing my responsibilities, not emotionally, but practically. The tasks I handled, the relationships I managed, the decisions I influenced quietly. Seeing it all laid out like that was unsettling. It was more than I had ever admitted, even to myself. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel something close to anger. Not explosive, focused, the kind that sharpens rather than burns. It came with another realization, just as unsettling. I had been protecting this arrangement as much as it had been limiting me. By staying silent, by being agreeable, I had helped keep the rules intact. The next day, I returned with the same calm exterior, but I paid attention differently. I watched who spoke in meetings and who listened, who was thanked and who was assumed. I noticed how often my mother deferred to my sister on matters that had little to do with her actual involvement. I noticed how rarely anyone asked whether I was okay with something, only whether I could handle it. In the afternoon, a vendor called with a question that revealed a small discrepancy in our accounts. Nothing alarming, just a mismatch in dates. I flagged it and brought it to my mother's attention. She brushed it off, saying it was already handled. Something in her tone felt rehearsed. I nodded and walked away, but the feeling stayed with me. It was the first time I wondered whether not knowing was part of the design. That night, I took a walk around my neighborhood, the air cool against my skin. I thought about loyalty and how easily it could be confused with obligation. About how often women were taught to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to be grateful for inclusion rather than insist on fairness. I thought about how many times I had chosen harmony over honesty. By the time I got home, I knew one thing for certain. I was done assuming that silence would protect me. I did not know yet what paying attention would uncover, or where it would lead. I only knew that I could no longer afford to move through this as if the rules were the same for everyone. Something had been exposed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. I went to bed that night with a question turning quietly in my mind, waiting for the right moment to be answered. The next morning, the question was still there, sitting in my chest like a smooth stone I could not swallow. I went in early again, not because anyone asked me to, but because I always had, and because some part of me wanted to see what the day looked like before my mother and my sister arrived and filled the air with their version of reality. I unlocked the front door, disarmed the alarm, and stood for a moment listening to the quiet. The building sounded different at this hour, like it was holding its breath. I had barely set my bag down when my phone rang. It was our biggest vendor, the one who supplied specialty materials we needed to keep contracts on schedule. They did not call me first because I was the owner daughter. They called me first because I was the person who actually solved problems. "Hey," he said, sounding tense. "We have an issue with that shipment for the Miller account. The paperwork on your end does not match the purchase order. If we cannot clear this up today, we cannot release it, and that pushes your timeline back." I closed my eyes for a second. The Miller account was not just another client. It was the kind of client my mother liked to brag about at dinner parties, the kind my sister referenced in her little speeches about growth. Losing time on it would cost us money and reputation, and it would be noticed. "Okay," I said. "Keep it on hold. I am pulling everything up right now. Give me 10 minutes." I sat at my desk, fingers moving quickly, pulling up emails, scanning attachments, comparing numbers. I found the mismatch almost immediately. Someone had approved a change to the order, but the approval email never made it to the vendor thread. It was the kind of slip that happens when people talk in closed offices and assume the rest of the world will adjust around them. I could have marched straight into my mother's office and asked why this was changed without me. I could have demanded an explanation. Instead, I did what I always did. I fixed it. I called the vendor back and walked him through the correction. I forwarded the missing approval, wrote a clean summary, attached the updated purchase order, and asked him to confirm release. His tone eased as he read it. "There it is," he said. "That is what we needed. We can ship this out this afternoon. You just saved your whole week." I exhaled slowly. Thank you for catching it, I said. I appreciate you calling. He laughed softly. I call you because you are the only one who actually knows what is going on over there. No offense, but I do not know how you keep that place running. The words landed harder than he meant them to. I pictured my mother saying family works for free, as if the business ran on love and loyalty and some magical sense of togetherness. Here was someone outside the family, someone with no reason to flatter me, saying out loud what I had started to feel in my bones. That I was not just helping. I was holding the spine of this place upright. Thanks, I managed, and ended the call. For a few minutes, I just sat there staring at my screen. The office was still quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear the air conditioner kick on and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I felt a strange mix of pride and nausea. Pride because I knew I was competent. Nausea because competence without recognition starts to feel like a trap. A little later, my mother arrived, brisk as always, and my sister followed not long after. They walked in talking about some upcoming meeting, some partnership they were excited about. My sister had her laptop bag, my mother had her coffee, and both of them looked like people who believed the day would unfold according to their plans. My mother stopped by my desk. "Did the vendor confirm the Miller shipment?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It goes out this afternoon." There was a mismatch in the paperwork. I corrected it and sent the updated approval. She nodded. As if I had told her, I refilled the printer paper. "Good," she said and moved on. My sister did not even look up from her phone. She said something about how important it was we keep high-profile accounts happy. She said it like an observation, not like a reminder that those accounts were being kept happy by the person sitting 10 feet away. Then she disappeared into my mother's office again. I watched them go, and something in me went still. Not numb. Clear. It was not that they did not know what I did. They relied on it. They counted on it. But in their minds, it did not translate into value that required repayment. It translated into a resource that could be used quietly. The day kept moving, and I kept doing my job. Only now, every task had an edge. I took calls, returned emails, organized schedules, smoothed out minor chaos. I noticed how often people asked me for answers, and how rarely anyone asked me how I was holding up. I noticed how often my mother used my work as a foundation for her confidence, and how often my sister used it as a backdrop for her image. In the afternoon, the vendor emailed me a quick confirmation. Shipment released. He added a line at the bottom that made my throat tighten. "By the way," he wrote, "if you ever get tired of being the one doing all the heavy lifting, let me know. People who can run operations like you do not work for free." I read that sentence twice. Then I leaned back in my chair and let it settle. People do not work for free. That was what my sister had said too, the day she smirked over her payment notification. But she had meant it as a weapon. The vendor meant it as truth. When the workday finally ended, I stayed a few minutes after everyone else left, not to clean up, not to prove I was dedicated, just to sit in the silence and think. The building emptied out slowly, footsteps fading, lights shutting off in other rooms. I could have gone home right away. Instead, I pulled up a blank document on my computer and started writing down what had happened with the Miller account. Not because I wanted to complain, because I wanted to see it clearly. Date, time, who called, what the issue was, what I did, what the outcome was. I stared at the list when I finished. It looked like something you would put in a report, something you would hand to a manager to justify a raise. I felt a twist of bitterness. I was making a report for myself. I saved the document and closed it. Then I opened my email and searched my own sent folder. I typed in keywords, vendor names, client names. I scrolled through months of messages. There were so many moments like this. Small crises, quick fixes, conversations where I had been the bridge between our business and the outside world. I had done it so long that it had become invisible even to me. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister. "Can you cover the call tomorrow with the Hendersons?" She wrote. "I have something important." I stared at the message. The old me would have typed back, "Of course, no problem, happy to help." The old me would have felt a small sting and swallowed it, telling myself family helps family. Instead, I set the phone down and let it sit. I did not answer right away. I sat in my office chair and listened to the quiet again. I thought about the vendor comment. People who can run operations like you do not work for free. I thought about my mother voice. Family works for free. Two sentences, two worlds, and I was standing in the middle. I finally picked up my phone and typed, "I can do it. But I need the full details by end of day, and I need to be listed as the point of contact on the account moving forward if I am handling it. Send me the info." It was not dramatic. It was not angry. It was simply a condition, a small line drawn where there had never been one before. A few minutes later, she replied with a thumbs up. That was it. No acknowledgement, no question, no pushback. It was as if she expected I would keep doing what I did as long as she could get what she needed. The thumbs up felt like confirmation. Not that she agreed, that she did not take me seriously. I left the building and drove home, my mind busy in a way it had not been before. Not spinning with hurt feelings, but turning over facts. My work had value. It had a price. The world outside our family understood that. The only place where my work was treated as free was inside the circle that benefited most from it. That night, I opened my laptop again at my kitchen table. I pulled up the list of responsibilities I had started in Chapter 2 and added to it. Vendor relations, contract management, client escalation, scheduling, compliance, training new staff when turnover hit. I kept going until the list filled the screen. Then I looked at it and felt something shift. Not into rage, but into a steadier kind of resolve. If my family wanted to treat me like I was invisible financially, they could only do it as long as I helped them believe their own story, as long as I played the part of the grateful helper who did not ask questions. I realized I had been living inside their language, their labels, their definitions. Heart, helper, family. None of those words had protected me. I closed the laptop and stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, porch lights glowing softly. I thought about my mother, about how she could love me and still use me. I thought about my sister, about how easy it was for her to smirk over a payment that came from my mother hand and my invisible labor. I did not know yet what I would do. I only knew I was done pretending I did not understand my own value. And once you stop pretending, you start seeing things you cannot unsee. The vendor mismatch had been a small crisis, the kind that would have vanished into the day before. Now it felt like a spotlight. Proof that the business leaned on me in ways no one wanted to name. I went to bed with that thought, and with a new one forming underneath it. If my work had a price, then there had to be a reason my mother and my sister were so determined not to pay it. And the longer I sat with that question, the more it sounded like something I could no longer ignore. I woke up the next morning with that question still humming under my skin, quieter now, but sharper, like it had found a place to settle. I did not rush. I moved through my apartment slowly, making coffee, standing at the counter while it brewed, watching the steam rise. For years, my days had started with urgency, with a mental checklist already ticking off before my feet hit the floor. That morning, I let myself feel the space where certainty used to be. At work, the rhythm was familiar enough to lull anyone back into autopilot. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of conversations drifting through open doors. I took my seat and started sorting through the paperwork that had piled up overnight. Invoices, confirmations, internal notes. I had looked at these kinds of documents 1,000 times. That day, I looked differently. The first thing that caught my eye was small, almost nothing at all. A line item on an invoice that did not match what I remembered approving. The number was slightly higher, the description a little vague. I frowned, scrolling back through my emails to check the original request. The figures did not line up. It could have been a typo. It could have been a late change. I told myself not to read too much into it. Still, I flagged it and walked down the hall to my mother's office. She was on her phone, gesturing for me to wait. I stood there, holding the invoice, listening to her side of the conversation. She sounded relaxed, confident, like someone who believed everything was under control. When she hung up, she smiled at me. "What do you need?" she asked. I held up the paper. "I was just checking this invoice," I said. "The amount is different from the original approval. Did something change?" She barely glanced at it. "Oh yes," she said. "We adjusted that after the fact. It was already taken care of." Her answer came too fast, too smooth. I waited for more, some explanation that would fill in the gap. It did not come. "Okay," I said, keeping my tone even. "I just wanted to make sure it was logged correctly." She waved her hand, the same gesture she had used the night of the payment notification. "It is fine," she said. "You worry too much sometimes." I nodded and left the office, the invoice still warm in my hand. Worry too much. I had heard that phrase my entire life. It had always worked too. It made me doubt my instincts, made me second-guess my questions. This time, it did not land the same way. Back at my desk, I pulled up the file history. The change had been made late in the evening, after I had left. There was an approval attached, forwarded from my sister. I stared at the timestamp. I remembered that night. I remembered locking up, saying goodnight, going home. No one had mentioned an adjustment. No one had asked for my input. Even though I was the one who handled this vendor relationship, it was not the change itself that unsettled me. It was the ease with which it had been brushed aside. Around mid-morning, my sister stopped by my desk. She asked if I had a minute. I said yes. She leaned against the edge of the desk, casual, comfortable. "Mom said you had a question about an invoice," she said. "Everything is fine. We just needed to move quickly on that one." I looked up at her. I kept my voice light. "I just wanted to understand the change," I said. "It impacts how we report the costs." She smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. "You do not need to worry about that part," she said. "I have it covered." Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Covered. Like a blanket pulled over something that should not be seen. I nodded. "All right," I said. She straightened and walked away, already pulling out her phone, her attention shifting without effort. I sat there for a moment, the office noise washing over me. I felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes when something clicks into place. I opened my email and searched for the original approval thread. I found it easily. I compared it to the forwarded version my sister had sent the vendor. The wording was slightly different. Not enough to raise alarms on its own. Enough to change responsibility. Enough to make it look like decisions had flowed through channels they had not. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. I did not confront anyone. I did not send a follow-up email. I did not ask for clarification. Instead, I saved copies of the documents to a folder on my computer. One I named something bland enough not to draw attention. Admin notes. It felt almost silly, the secrecy of it, but it also felt necessary. The rest of the day unfolded with a series of small moments that landed differently now. A comment from my mother about how stressful managing finances was, followed by a quick subject change. A joke from my sister about how I would not want the headache of dealing with higher level decisions anyway. Each thing on its own could be dismissed. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Late in the afternoon, a junior staff member stopped by my desk to ask about a schedule change. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I hope it is okay I am asking you," she said. "I know sometimes things change without notice." I assured her it was fine and helped her sort it out. As she walked away, I wondered how often confusion trickled down from decisions made in rooms I was not invited into. How often people like her absorb the consequences while being told it was just the way things were. When the office finally quieted down, I stayed behind again. Not out of habit, but out of intention. I pulled up the folder I had started the night before and added the invoice discrepancy, noting dates, amounts, who had approved what. I did not feel dramatic doing it. I felt methodical. As I worked, memories surfaced, uninvited. Times when my mother had explained away odd decisions with a laugh. Times when my sister had brushed off questions as unnecessary. I had always trusted that if something mattered, I would be told. That trust felt naive now. I locked up and walked to my car, the evening air cool against my face. On the drive home, I replayed my mother's response. It was already taken care of. The phrase echoed differently now. Taken care of by whom? At whose expense? At home, I heated leftovers and ate standing at the counter, too restless to sit. I opened my laptop and pulled up the document where I had been listing my responsibilities. I added another section: irregularities, questions, things to revisit. The list was still short. That scared me more than a long one would have. I thought about confronting them, about laying everything out and demanding answers. The idea made my chest tighten. I knew how that would go. Denial, minimizing, hurt expressions, accusations of mistrust. The story would shift from facts to feelings, and the truth would get lost in the noise. Instead, I chose something quieter. Over the next few days, I paid attention in a way I never had before. I listened to how decisions were described after the fact. I watched who was included and who was informed. I noticed how often my name was used as reassurance without my presence. It was subtle, the way power moves when it does not expect to be questioned. One afternoon, my mother mentioned offhandedly that a partnership had been finalized. I asked when. She hesitated, then said it had been in the works for a while. Later that day, I found the initial proposal in an email thread from months earlier. I had been copied, but never consulted. My role had been assumed. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt a quiet sadness settle over me. Not the sharp pain of betrayal, but something heavier. Grief for the version of my family I had believed in. Grief for the simplicity of trust. Seeing clearly came with a cost. I felt it in the way conversations grew more careful, in the way I chose my words. I felt it in the distance creeping into moments that used to feel easy. But underneath that sadness was something steadier. Resolve. I was no longer asking myself if something was wrong. I was asking how deep it went. The next morning, as I got dressed for work, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same. Nothing about my face revealed the shift happening underneath. That made me smile, just a little. There was power in being underestimated. Power in listening when others assumed you were not. I grabbed my bag and headed out, the folder on my computer waiting quietly for the next piece to fall into place. I did not know yet what I would find or how it would end. I only knew that lies, even small ones, require upkeep. And I had decided to start watching closely. I did not tell anyone what I was doing, not because I thought it was wrong, but because I had learned how quickly curiosity could be labeled disloyalty in my family. I went into work that morning quieter than usual, moving through the space with a deliberate calm. I greeted people, answered questions, handled tasks, all the things I had always done. The difference was that I was watching instead of absorbing. I noticed how often information floated past me without landing, conversations that paused when I walked by, decisions that were announced as conclusions rather than discussions. I noticed how frequently my mother used the phrase already handled, and how my sister used, we decided without ever naming who we included in that we. Before, I had let those moments slide, chalking them up to efficiency or stress. Now, they felt like patterns. I kept a small notebook tucked into my bag. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. At first, I used it the way I always had, jotting reminders, tasks, names. Then I started adding dates, times, who said what, and when. I told myself it was just for clarity, just to keep track. Still, every time I wrote something down, my heart beat a little faster, as if my body understood the significance before my mind fully caught up. The first receipt I saved was not money. It was an email. It came in late in the afternoon, forwarded to me by my sister with a short note asking me to take care of a follow-up. The email thread showed a decision being made about a client adjustment, one that directly affected how much extra work I would need to do over the next few weeks. My sister had agreed to it without consulting me, then passed the execution my way, like an afterthought. Normally, I would have replied all, confirmed I had it handled, and moved on. This time, I saved the email to my computer before responding. I labeled the folder with something bland and forgettable, the kind of name no one would ever click on unless they already knew it mattered. I did not feel sneaky. I felt steady. I handled the task, just as I always had, but the act of saving that email shifted something inside me. It was like putting a bookmark in a book I had been reading on autopilot. I could finally see where I was in the story. As the days went on, the folder grew slowly. Another email where my name was used to reassure a client without my involvement. A calendar invite that implied my availability without asking. A note from my mother referencing a process I supposedly oversaw, one I had never been invited to discuss. None of it looked alarming on its own. Together, it began to feel intentional. I started to understand why I had never done this before. It was not because I was careless or naive. It was because I had believed trust made documentation unnecessary. I had believed love meant you did not keep score. I had believed that if something mattered, it would be said out loud. Those beliefs had shaped my behavior for years. I did not write things down because I did not want to appear suspicious. I did not ask for confirmation because I did not want to seem difficult. I did not push for clarity because I did not want to disrupt the peace. Looking back, I could see how neatly those instincts had served everyone but me. One afternoon, as I was scanning through a set of invoices, a colleague stopped by my desk. She lingered, glancing at the papers spread out in front of me. "You are really on top of things lately," she said, her tone light but curious. I smiled. "Just trying to keep everything straight." She hesitated, then added, "You know, sometimes it feels like asking questions around here makes people nervous." I looked up at her. She was not accusing. She was warning. I kept my expression neutral. "I think clarity helps everyone," I said. She nodded, but her eyes flicked down the hall toward my mother's office before she walked away. That small exchange stayed with me. It was the first time I realized my attention was visible. From then on, I was careful. Not secretive, just precise. I did not linger over documents where others could see. I did not ask questions I already knew the answers to. I turned memory into evidence quietly, methodically. At night, I transferred notes from my notebook into a private document on my laptop. Dates, actions, outcomes. I kept my language factual, stripped of emotion. I wanted to see the shape of things, not how they made me feel. Writing it all out was exhausting in a way that surprised me. It required me to confront how often I had smoothed over discomfort by telling myself it did not matter. Some nights, I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, the weight of it pressing on my chest. Paying attention had a cost. It made conversations feel staged, laughter sound thinner. It made me aware of how often I was being managed rather than included. There was a loneliness to that awareness, a sense of standing slightly outside my own family. My mother noticed the shift, though she never named it directly. She asked once if everything was okay, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion beneath the concern. I told her I was fine, just busy. She accepted that answer easily. She always had. My sister, on the other hand, began checking in more often, little messages asking if I needed anything, if I was feeling overwhelmed. On the surface, it looked like care. Underneath, it felt like monitoring. Each message reinforced my decision to keep my thoughts to myself. One evening, as I was packing up to leave, my mother called me into her office. She wanted to review some upcoming changes, nothing urgent, just planning ahead. I listened, nodded, offered practical input when asked. At one point, she mentioned a budget adjustment that affected a department I oversaw. I asked a simple question. When had that been approved? She paused, just a beat too long, then said it was handled during a meeting I had not been part of. She said it lightly, as if my absence were a given. I nodded and wrote it down later. Driving home that night, I felt a tightness behind my eyes. Not tears, pressure. I realized how much energy I had spent over the years trying to anticipate needs so no one else would have to think about them. That energy had been redirected now, toward observation. It was a different kind of work, quieter and heavier. There were moments when I wanted to stop, when I wanted to close the folder, throw away the notebook, go back to believing that this was all a misunderstanding. Those moments usually came when my mother did something kind, brought me lunch, asked about my day. Love and manipulation can coexist more easily than we like to admit. Recognizing that does not make the love disappear. It just makes it complicated. One night, as I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the latest additions to my list, I felt something settle into place. This was no longer about proving anything to anyone else. It was about knowing where I stood, about refusing to be gaslit by my own loyalty. I made myself a promise then, not dramatic, not spoken out loud. I would keep paying attention. I would keep records. I would not rush to conclusions, but I would not look away either. Whatever this was, it deserved to be seen clearly. The next day, I noticed how often my name was used to smooth over tension, how often my presence reassured clients and staff alike. I noticed how rarely that reassurance flowed back to me. It became obvious that my reliability had been folded into the business identity itself, taken for granted as something that would always be there. Late in the afternoon, my sister asked if I could stay late to cover a call she could not make. Her message was casual, confident I would say yes. I typed back that I could, but only if she sent me the full background and looped me in officially. A small boundary, nothing more. She responded with a brief, "Okay." No argument, no acknowledgement. That was when it hit me. They did not push back because they did not yet see the line. They still believed I would keep stepping over it. I left the office at a reasonable hour and went for a walk before going home. The air was cool, the sky streaked with fading light. I thought about how many women I knew who had been told they were indispensable and treated as optional. How often loyalty was rewarded with expectation rather than respect. By the time I got home, my resolve felt quieter but stronger. I opened my laptop one last time that night and added a new entry to my file, not a document or an email this time, a thought. Once evidence exists, denial becomes a choice. I saved the file and closed the computer. I did not know yet how or when this would come to a head. I only knew that I was done collecting memories that could be dismissed. From now on, I would keep receipts, and whatever came next would be built on something solid. The warning came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually slipped past without leaving a mark. I was finishing up a report when I heard my name spoken softly behind me, not the brisk tone people used when they needed something fixed, but something quieter, cautious. I turned and saw Lena standing there, her hands folded together like she was deciding whether to stay or go. Lena had worked with us years ago, back when the business was smaller and messier. She was capable, sharp, and she did not flatter anyone. I remembered being surprised when she left, surprised and a little hurt, because no one ever explained why. Now she stood in front of me, older, more tired around the eyes, as if time had taught her lessons she would have preferred to skip. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. I nodded and gestured toward the empty conference room. We sat across from each other at the long table, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel something heavy pressing against the air, like a storm waiting for permission to break. "I heard you are still here," she said finally, "still doing everything." I smiled, a reflex I did not bother to hide. Someone has to. She watched me closely. That answer used to satisfy people. It did not satisfy her. "I do not want to overstep," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But I need to say something, and if I do not say it now, I probably never will." My hands rested flat on the table. I felt a familiar urge to reassure, to smooth things over, to make it easier for her to speak. I stopped myself. "Go on," I said. She took a breath. "When I worked here, I thought if I just did my job well and stayed loyal, things would work out. I thought the same things you probably think, that it was family, that we were building something together." I said nothing. I did not interrupt. I had learned the value of letting people talk when they finally decided to. She leaned forward slightly. "The first time I asked a real question about how decisions were made, things changed. Not right away. Slowly. Meetings I was not invited to. Information I got late. Work that disappeared from my plate and showed up somewhere else with a different name attached to it." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort underneath. "I thought it was my imagination at first," she continued. "I told myself not to be paranoid. That is what they want you to think. That asking questions is the same as causing problems." I swallowed. Something cold slid into place inside me. "What happened?" I asked. She smiled without humor. "I left before it got worse. Before I was blamed for something I did not do. Before my reputation took a hit I could not undo." The room felt smaller. The buzzing lights seemed louder. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I see the look in your eyes," she said. "I saw it in my own reflection once. And because people like you, people who hold things together quietly, tend to get hurt the worst when they finally notice what is happening." I thought about the notebook in my bag, the folder on my computer, the careful way I had been moving through my days. She lowered her voice. "If you are paying attention now, if you are writing things down, you need to be careful." My heart thumped hard enough that I felt it in my throat. "Careful how?" She glanced at the door, then back at me. "Careful about who knows you are paying attention. Careful about assuming good intentions where there are patterns. They do not like it when the rules are questioned, especially not by someone they depend on." I sat back in my chair. For a moment, I wanted to laugh it off, to tell her she was being dramatic, that this was my family, not some corporate nightmare. The words died before they reached my mouth. "Did you ever think maybe it was just a misunderstanding?" I asked quietly. All the time, she said. That is why it took me so long to leave. Love makes you patient. It also makes you vulnerable. Her words settled heavily between us. Love makes you patient. It also makes you vulnerable. She straightened. I am not telling you to do anything. I am not asking you to burn bridges or start a war. I just want you to know you are not imagining things, and that once you see it, there is no going back to not seeing it. We sat in silence for a few seconds. I felt exposed, like someone had reached into my chest and named something I had been trying to keep unspoken. Thank you, I said finally. She nodded. Be careful, she repeated. Then she stood, gave me a small, tired smile, and left the room. I stayed there long after she was gone, staring at the surface of the table. The warning echoed in my mind, not as fear, but as confirmation. I was not alone. I was not dramatic. I was not ungrateful. This had happened before, to someone else who had tried to be good, tried to be loyal, tried to be patient. When I returned to my desk, everything felt different. Not because anyone had done anything new, but because I now knew what silence could cost. I noticed who watched me as I worked, who looked away when our eyes met. I noticed how my mother's voice changed slightly when she spoke to me, warmer on the surface, more guarded underneath. I noticed how my sister checked in more often, little questions wrapped in concern. That evening, my mother asked me to stay late to help prepare for an upcoming meeting. I said I could not, that I had plans. It was the truth. My plan was to go home and think. Her eyebrows lifted just a fraction. She said, all right, maybe another time. She did not argue. She did not need to. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. The expectation had been broken, and she had noticed. At home, I paced my living room, replaying Lena words. Before my reputation took a hit I could not undo. The phrase stuck with me. It reframed everything I had been doing. This was not just about being paid fairly or recognized. This was about protection, about understanding how easily loyalty could be weaponized. I opened my laptop and reviewed my notes. I added a new entry. This one marked with Lena name and the date. I wrote down exactly what she said, as close to her words as I could remember. It felt strange, documenting a conversation that had not involved numbers or contracts. It felt necessary. The next few days passed in a haze of heightened awareness. I did my job, but I also watched. I noticed how often my sister spoke for me in meetings, how often my mother referenced my support without acknowledging my role. I noticed how decisions were framed as collective when they were not. One afternoon, I overheard my sister on the phone, her voice low but animated. She was talking about a project I had been managing for months, presenting it as something she was overseeing. I stood still, just out of sight, listening. When she hung up, she walked past me without a word, as if nothing had happened. I did not confront her. I did not correct the record. I felt something else instead, a shift from hurt to calculation. This was not an accident, it was a habit. Later that week, a minor issue arose, one that would usually have had me stepping in immediately to smooth it over. This time, I waited. Not long enough to cause damage, just long enough to see what happened without me. Confusion spread quickly. People asked questions. My mother looked unsettled. My sister grew irritated. I stepped in then, calmly, efficiently, fixing the problem in minutes. No one thanked me. They just exhaled, relieved, and moved on. The message was clear. My presence prevented chaos. My absence revealed it. That night, I sat on my couch and thought about Lena leaving, about how she had walked away rather than fight a system that was never going to thank her for her loyalty. I wondered if she had felt like a failure at first, like she had given up. I wondered how long it took her to realize that leaving was an act of self-respect, I was not ready to leave. Not yet. But I understood something I had not before. Staying without understanding the risks was no longer an option. The next morning, as I got dressed for work, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear Lena warning might have sparked had settled into something steadier. Knowledge. Knowledge is a point of no return. Once you know what you are dealing with, you cannot pretend it is something else. I walked into the building with my head up, my expression neutral. I did not announce anything. I did not challenge anyone. I simply carried the weight of what I knew and the certainty that I would not unlearn it. As the day unfolded, I added one more line to my notes, a reminder to myself. Silence protects those in power. Awareness protects me. I did not know yet what that protection would look like in practice or how much it would cost. I only knew that the warning had come too late for Lena and just in time for me. And from that moment on, I understood that whatever came next would demand more than patience. It would demand that I choose myself, even if that choice made others uncomfortable. I did not rush into action after that, even though part of me wanted to. Knowing something and using it are not the same thing, and I had learned enough to understand that timing mattered. Instead of changing my behavior all at once, I did something that felt almost unnatural to me. I slowed down, not in my work. I still did everything that needed to be done, still caught problems before they exploded, still kept the wheels turning. But I stopped filling in gaps no one acknowledged. I stopped anticipating needs that had never been clearly assigned to me. If something was not communicated, I let the silence sit for a moment before stepping in. It did not take long for that silence to become uncomfortable. The first crack showed up in a weekly coordination meeting I had always run quietly from the background. I usually prepared the agenda, sent reminders, summarized decisions afterward, all without being asked. That week, I waited. I showed up on time, notebook in hand, but I did not lead. My mother glanced around the table, then at me. "Are we starting?" she asked. I nodded. "Whenever you are ready." There was a pause, brief but noticeable. My sister jumped in, flipping open her laptop, trying to pull the conversation together. She stumbled over details she normally leaned on me to provide. Dates were off. Names were misremembered. People asked questions she could not answer on the spot. I watched, quietly, taking notes the way I always did, but not offering corrections unless someone asked me directly. The meeting ended 10 minutes later than usual, with less clarity and more tension hanging in the air. As people filed out, one of the managers lingered. "That felt different today," she said carefully. I met her eyes. "Different how?" "Like something was missing," she said. Then she smiled awkwardly and left. Something was missing. The phrase stayed with me all day. Later that afternoon, a client called, frustrated about a delay. I answered, listened, reassured as I always had. When I hung up, I realized my hands were steady. I was no longer scrambling to prove my usefulness. I knew it. And apparently, so did everyone else. My sister stopped by my desk not long after. Her tone was light, but there was an edge to it. "Hey," she said. "Can we talk for a second?" I followed her into the hallway. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You seemed kind of quiet in the meeting this morning," she said. I shrugged. I was listening. She studied my face. "Usually, you help move things along." I chose my words carefully. "I figured if there was something specific you needed from me, you would ask." Her lips pressed together for a moment. "Right. Sure." She walked away without another word. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of guilt and clarity. I was not withholding. I was responding appropriately. The discomfort came from the shift, not from anything I had done wrong. That evening, my mother called me into her office. She closed the door behind me, a small gesture that made my shoulders tense automatically. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes. Why do you ask?" She hesitated. "You just seem different lately. A little distant." I kept my voice calm. "I am still here, still doing my job." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "You know we rely on you," she said. "You are such an important part of this place." The words might have warmed me once. Now they felt unfinished. I waited. She looked at me, clearly expecting something. Gratitude, maybe. Reassurance. Instead, I stayed quiet. After a moment, she waved her hand. "Never mind. Just checking in." I left her office with my heart pounding. That had been the first time she acknowledged reliance without attaching it to expectation. It was small, but it mattered. At home that night, I opened my notes and wrote about the meeting, the conversation, the way things had shifted when I stopped filling every gap. I wrote down how it felt to let silence exist without rushing to fix it. Uncomfortable? Yes. But also honest. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Little things went awry when I did not preemptively smooth them over. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough friction to make people notice the absence of my invisible labor. A report was delayed because no one realized I had always compiled it. A scheduling conflict surfaced because I had not quietly resolved it days earlier. Each time, someone would eventually come to me, asking for help, and I would provide it. But now it was visible, named, requested. The difference was subtle, but powerful. One afternoon, a staff member knocked on my door and asked if I had time to help with an issue that technically fell under my sister's purview. I said yes, and we worked through it together. As she left, she paused. "You do so much around here," she said. "I do not know how we would manage without you." I smiled, but inside, something twisted. "Manage without you." The words echoed Lena warning. People like you get hurt the worst when they finally notice what is happening. That evening, I ran into Lena by chance at a small grocery store near my apartment. I almost did not recognize her at first. She looked lighter somehow, like she was no longer carrying something heavy. We stood in the aisle talking for a few minutes, catching up. She asked how things were going. I hesitated, then said carefully that I was paying closer attention now. She nodded. That is usually the hardest part. I told her briefly about the meeting, about stepping back just enough to see what happened. She listened, her expression thoughtful. "Be careful," she said again, but this time there was something else in her voice. Not just warning. Respect. People do not like it when the person holding everything together stops doing it silently. "I know," I said. She smiled. "Just remember, noticing your power does not mean you have to use it all at once." We said goodbye, and I walked home feeling steadier. I was not imagining this. I was not alone, and I was not powerless. Back at work, my sister began involving me more directly, though she framed it as delegation rather than inclusion. She would ask for my input in ways that felt strategic, almost performative, especially when others were present. I responded professionally, offering what was asked and nothing more. My mother, on the other hand, grew more tentative. She started checking details with me instead of assuming I would handle them. It was as if the ground beneath her confidence had shifted slightly, and she was adjusting her footing. One morning, she asked me to join her for coffee before the day started. We sat in a quiet corner of the break room, mugs warming our hands. "You have always been so reliable," she said. "I hope you know that." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw both love and fear there. Fear of losing control, fear of change. "I know," I said. "I also know reliability is not the same as being replaceable." She frowned, clearly unsettled by the comment, but she did not argue. As the weeks passed, I felt something building beneath the surface, not an explosion, but pressure. My careful adjustments had revealed something important. The business did not run on titles or visibility, it ran on work. And my work had been propping up a structure that did not want to acknowledge its dependence. I started to understand the leverage I held even if I had no intention of abusing it. Leverage is not about threats. It is about truth. One afternoon, I opened my folder and reviewed everything I had collected so far. Emails, notes, patterns. It was not dramatic. It was comprehensive. Enough to tell a clear story to anyone willing to see it. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. I was no longer gathering evidence out of fear. I was preparing for a conversation that would eventually have to happen. The thought made my stomach flutter. Not dread exactly. Anticipation. I did not know yet how or when I would bring everything into the open. I only knew that the quiet experiment of stepping back had shown me something undeniable. They needed me more than they wanted to admit. And once that truth is visible, it cannot be pushed back into the dark. As I shut down my computer for the night, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever came next would be harder. There would be resistance. There would be hurt. But the illusion that had kept me small was already cracking. I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me, carrying that knowledge with me like a key. Not to escape. Not yet. But to open whatever door I decided was next. The shift did not go unnoticed for long, and when it finally surfaced, it came wrapped in politeness and urgency. My mother asked me to join her and my sister for lunch, framed as a chance to align before a busy quarter. The word align had become a signal. I agreed and chose a place close to the office. Neutral ground where voices stayed measured and interruptions were unlikely. We sat near the window, sunlight catching on silverware, menus untouched. My sister launched into updates the way she always did, brisk and confident, touching on growth, visibility, expansion. I listened, nodding when appropriate, letting her finish without filling in gaps. My mother watched me closely, as if gauging whether I would step in and smooth the rhythm the way I used to. When the server left, my mother folded her hands. "I wanted to talk about roles," she said. "With things growing, it feels important to be clear." Clear was another signal. I waited. My sister smiled in that polished way she used for presentations. "We have been thinking about formalizing some responsibilities," she said, "making sure everyone is focused on what they do best." I met her eyes. "What does that look like?" She slid a printed sheet across the table. A draft outline, titles, reporting lines, a tidy diagram that put her at the top of a new initiative, my mother overseeing finances, and me listed as operation support. Support. The word sat there, small and heavy. I took my time reading it. The language was careful, flattering even, essential, trusted, backbone. But the structure was unmistakable. More responsibility, less authority, still no mention of compensation beyond vague future review. "This is interesting," I said. My mother leaned forward. "We just want to make sure you are not overwhelmed. You do so much. We thought this might help define things. Define things in a way that keeps me where I am," I thought, doing everything without a voice. I kept my tone even. "Does this include a formal contract?" My sister blinked. "A contract?" "Yes," I said. "Scope, authority, compensation, review cycles." The silence that followed felt longer than it was. My mother cleared her throat. "We were thinking we could revisit compensation after we see how the next phase goes." I nodded slowly. "How long is the next phase?" My sister jumped in. "A few months. We need flexibility right now." Flexibility for whom? I wondered. I set the paper down. "I am happy to discuss roles," I said, "but clarity has to go both ways. I cannot take on expanded responsibilities without a contract that reflects them." My mother frowned. the crease between her eyebrows deepening. "We are family," she said softly. "We have always trusted each other." "Trust does not replace clarity," I replied, "especially when expectations are changing." My sister exhaled, impatience slipping through. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." I met her gaze. "It is complicated because it has been informal for too long." The lunch ended politely, but the air had shifted. Outside, as we walked back toward the office, my sister lagged behind with me. "What is really going on with you?" she asked, voice low. "You have been different." I stopped walking. "I am being precise," I said. "That is all." She scoffed lightly. "You act like we are trying to take advantage of you." I did not raise my voice. "I am acting like I am responsible for my work and my future." She stared at me for a beat, then shook her head and walked ahead. I followed at my own pace, feeling steadier than I expected. The conversation had not exploded. It had exposed. That afternoon, my mother asked me to help prepare materials for a board update scheduled for the following week. I agreed, then asked to be included in the planning call. She hesitated, then said yes. Progress came in inches. On the call, I listened as decisions were discussed in broad strokes. When details came up that touched my area, I asked direct questions. Who signs off? What is the timeline? How are we measuring success? The room adjusted around the questions. Answers sharpened. When the call ended, my mother thanked me for the clarity. It was the first time she had used that word for my contributions. Still, the outline from lunch lingered. That evening, I reviewed my notes and documents, not with anger, but with purpose. The pattern was clear. Every attempt to define my role stopped just short of acknowledging my leverage. They wanted structure without surrendering control. The next day, a small crisis hit. A client threatened to pause a contract over a miscommunication tied to a decision made without my input. I was looped in late, the way I often was. I assessed quickly and saw the fix. This time, I asked for written approval before proceeding. My sister called me, irritation sharp in her voice. "Why are you slowing this down?" I kept my voice calm. "I am protecting the business. I need confirmation before I commit us." She sighed. "Fine. Do what you need." I got the confirmation. I fixed the issue. The client stayed. Later, my mother stopped by my desk. "Thank you," she said. "That could have gone badly." I nodded. It could have. As the days passed, the pressure mounted in quieter ways. Requests came with more qualifiers. Conversations circled the same points. The draft outline reappeared with minor edits, still avoiding the core issue. Each time, I responded consistently. Contract first. Clarity first. One evening, my mother asked me to come by her house. The familiar living room felt different now, the family photos on the wall like witnesses. We sat at the kitchen table where so many conversations had ended unresolved. "I do not want this to turn into a standoff," she said. "Neither do I." She rubbed her hands together. "You have always been here. You know that. We just need time." "Time is not neutral," I said gently. "Time favors the status quo." Her eyes flicked up. "You sound like a lawyer." I smiled faintly. "I sound like someone who has learned to be careful." She leaned back, studying me. "Are you threatening to leave?" I chose my words. "I am asking to stay in a way that is sustainable." The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed, headlights sliding across the ceiling. Finally, she nodded. "Let me think about it." I left with no promises, but with something else. Acknowledgement. She had heard me. Back at work, my sister was cooler, more formal. She delegated through email instead of conversation. I responded professionally, keeping everything documented. The folder grew, not with accusations, but with confirmations. Then came the call that changed the temperature. A potential partner asked to speak with me directly about operations. My sister forwarded the request with a short note telling me to handle it. On the call, the partner asked detailed questions, ones that revealed how much they already relied on my systems. At the end, they said something that echoed in my chest. "We would not move forward without you involved at a senior level," they said. "Operations makes or breaks this." When I hung up, I sat still for a moment, hands resting on the desk. This was not leverage I had created. It was leverage that existed because of the work. I shared the summary with my mother and my sister, including the partner condition. My sister replied with a curt acknowledgement. My mother asked to meet. In her office, she closed the door and exhaled. "They asked for you by name," she said. "Yes." She looked at the window, then back at me. "We need to handle this carefully." I nodded. Carefully and clearly. She did not argue. Instead, she asked what I would need to feel comfortable moving forward. I listed it plainly. Title aligned with authority. Contract. Compensation that reflected responsibility. A review timeline. She wrote it down. I left her office with a strange mix of relief and gravity. This was no longer abstract. The lines had been drawn, not by confrontation, but by reality pressing in. That night, I did not open my laptop. I took a walk, letting the cool air settle my nerves. I thought about how quietly power reveals itself when you stop rushing to hide it. I thought about how often women are told to wait, to be patient, to trust. Patience is a virtue. It is not a substitute for fairness. When I got home, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister asking to talk tomorrow. I did not reply right away. I set the phone down and made tea, watching the steam curl upward. I was not angry. I was ready. I knew the next conversation would decide whether we moved toward something honest or something brittle. Either way, the pause had ended. The conversation happened the next morning in my mother's office. The door closed, the blinds half drawn like we were bracing for something delicate. My sister arrived a few minutes late, carrying her confidence the way she always did, shoulders back, expression composed. She smiled at me as if we were about to discuss something ordinary. I wondered if she believed that, or if it was just habit. We sat around the small table by the window. My mother cleared her throat and folded her hands. "I want us to talk openly," she said. "No defensiveness, no assumptions." I nodded. "That is all I have been asking for." My sister crossed her legs and leaned back. "Fine. Let us be open." She turned to me. "You are pushing for a contract and a title change because a partner asked for you. That is opportunistic." The word hung in the air, sharp. I did not flinch. "It is responsive," I said. "The work already exists. The responsibility already exists. The request just made it visible." She scoffed softly. "You make it sound like we have been hiding something." I met her eyes. "We have been avoiding naming it." My mother raised a hand. "Enough." She looked at my sister, then at me. "We are here because the business is at a point where informal arrangements are starting to break." That is true. What we need to decide is how we move forward without tearing ourselves apart. My sister leaned forward now. "We built this on trust," she said. "On family. Turning everything into paperwork changes the tone." I felt the familiar pull to soften, to reassure. I resisted it. "Paperwork protects trust," I said. "It does not replace it." She shook her head. "It puts a price on everything." I kept my voice steady. "Everything already has a price. We just have not been honest about who pays it." The silence stretched. My mother looked between us, calculating. Finally, she spoke. "I want to understand what you are asking for, clearly. No implications, no ultimatums." I took a breath. "A formal role that reflects the scope of my work." Authority to make decisions in my area without having to route everything through someone else. Compensation aligned with that responsibility. And transparency about how decisions are made. My sister laughed once, sharp. You want control. I did not raise my voice. I want accountability. Control without accountability is what we have now. Her jaw tightened. You are accusing us. I shook my head. I am describing a structure. My mother closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. She looked tired. If we do this, she said, things change. Expectations change. The dynamic changes. Yes, I said. They already have. My sister pushed back her chair slightly. So what happens if we say no? The room felt smaller. I chose my words with care. Then I will need to decide whether I can continue working here under the current conditions. My mother inhaled sharply. Is that a threat? It is a boundary. My sister stared at me, disbelief flickering across her face. You would walk away? From us? I held her gaze. I would walk toward something sustainable. She shook her head, anger rising. This is because of that partner call. You think you are indispensable now. I did not argue. I let the truth sit there. My mother spoke instead. They asked for her by name. She said quietly. That matters. My sister turned to her. Since when? Since yesterday. The realization hit her slowly. I saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes narrowed. This was not just about me anymore. It was about leverage she had not anticipated. We talked for over an hour. Voices rose and fell. Accusations surfaced and were pulled back. My mother kept circling the same concern. What this would do to the family. I kept circling mine. What the lack of clarity had already done to me. At one point, my sister said something that landed deeper than she intended. You have always been good at handling the boring stuff. Operations, details. That is why this works. I handle vision. You handle execution. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something quiet click into place. Execution is not boring, I said. It is where promises become reality. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time, she seemed unsure which angle to take. My mother rubbed her temples. I need time, she said. We need to consider the legal and financial implications. I nodded. Of course. My sister stood abruptly. I cannot believe this, she muttered, turning family into a negotiation. I stayed seated. Family without fairness is already a negotiation. It is just one where I have been losing. She left the office without looking back. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than a slam. My mother and I sat in silence for a moment. She looked older than she had the day before. I did not feel victorious. I felt resolved. I love you, she said finally. I need you to know that. I know, I said. Love is not the issue. She nodded slowly. Give me a few days. I left her office and went back to my desk, hands steady, mind clear. The temperature had changed. People sensed it. Conversations quieted when I walked by. Requests came through email instead of hallway chats. Everything felt more formal already, as if the future were rehearsing itself. That afternoon, the partner followed up, asking for next steps. I replied with a brief update, copying my mother, outlining timelines and noting that we were formalizing roles. The partner responded quickly, appreciative. They were used to clarity. It felt good to speak their language openly. When I got home that evening, I felt the weight of the day settle into my bones. I sat on the couch and stared at the wall for a long time, replaying the meeting. I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had broken something that could not be fixed. The doubt came, as it always did, right on schedule. Then I remembered the lunches where my role was minimized, the outlines that expanded my responsibility without expanding my authority, the years of invisible labor. I remembered Lena warning, I remembered the quiet experiment of stepping back and watching the gaps appear. I did not open my notes that night. I did not add anything to the folder. There was nothing new to record. The truth had been spoken out loud. 2 days passed. Work continued in a strange holding pattern. My sister avoided me. My mother was polite and distant. I focused on my tasks, keeping everything documented, everything clean. On the third day, my mother called me into her office again. This time, a man I recognized as our outside accountant was there, and a woman from a law firm I had seen on our letterhead. The sight steadied me. This was no longer personal. It was procedural. "We are going to draft something," my mother said. "A formal agreement. It is not final yet." I nodded. "Thank you." The lawyer asked me questions about my responsibilities. I answered calmly, thoroughly. The accountant asked about reporting lines and decision authority. I clarified. No one interrupted me. No one reframed my words. It felt surreal. After they left, my mother looked at me. "This will be hard for your sister." I considered that. "I do not want to hurt her," I said, "but I cannot keep hurting myself to avoid it." She did not argue. That evening, my sister called me. Her voice was tight. "I hear you brought lawyers into this." I did not rise to the bait. Mom did. She laughed bitterly. "You win then." "This is not about winning." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something softer. "I did not know you felt this way." I closed my eyes. I did not know how to say it in a way you would hear. Another pause. We ended the call without resolution, without apologies. It was not the ending people hope for. It was honest. As I went to bed that night, I felt a mix of grief and relief. The confrontation had not been explosive. It had been surgical. Something had been cut away. Something else had been exposed. I did not know yet what the final agreement would look like, or how our relationships would settle around it. I only knew that the moment of asking had passed, and the moment of choosing had begun. The draft arrived on a quiet morning, slipped into my inbox without ceremony, a simple subject line that made my pulse jump anyway. Proposed agreement. I did not open it right away. I finished my coffee, watched the light shift across my desk, let my breathing settle. I had learned not to rush moments like this. Rushing had never protected me. When I finally clicked it open, the document unfolded in clean lines and careful language. Title, scope, authority, compensation, review, termination. Words that used to feel abstract now felt like ground under my feet. I read slowly, once for understanding, once for implications, once for what was not there. It was not perfect. It was a starting point. My title reflected operations leadership, not support. Authority was defined, not implied. Compensation was listed in black and white, with benchmarks and timelines. There were clauses about transparency and reporting, about decision rights that did not route everything upward by default. The document acknowledged reality in a way our conversations never had. I closed the file and leaned back, letting the chair creak. Relief came first, then something heavier. Grief. Grief for how long it had taken to reach something this basic. Grief for the years of work that would never be retroactively named. My mother knocked softly and stepped into my office. She looked nervous, which was new. "Did you see it?" she asked. I nodded. "I am reviewing it." She hovered by the door. We tried to be fair. I met her eyes. You tried to be clear. She seemed to accept that distinction. "Take your time," she said. "We can adjust." After she left, my sister appeared in the doorway without knocking. Her posture was rigid, arms crossed like armor. "So," she said, "this is happening." I kept my tone neutral. "We are talking about it." She laughed under her breath. "You really went all the way." I did not respond immediately. I watched her, noticed the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes darted to the screen on my desk. This was not just anger, it was fear. "You know what this looks like?" she said. I nodded. "It looks like accountability." She stepped inside, lowering her voice. "You are changing everything." I considered that. I am changing my role. Everything else has been changing without me for a long time. She shook her head. "You always make it sound so dramatic." I did not argue. I let the silence stretch until she filled it. "Do you really think this makes us stronger?" she asked. I answered honestly. "I think pretending things are fine when they are not makes us brittle." She scoffed, but there was no heat behind it. "You always had a way with words." I smiled faintly. "And you always had a way with narratives." Her eyes narrowed, then softened. For a moment she looked tired. Just tired. Then she straightened and left without another word. I spent the rest of the day marking the document with comments, questions about scope creep, requests for clearer language around decision thresholds, notes on review cadence. I was not nitpicking. I was protecting myself from the future version of the same problems. The lawyer responded quickly, appreciative of the specificity. We scheduled a follow-up meeting. The accountant asked for inputs on budget adjustments. Work moved forward. Real work. The kind that acknowledges cause and effect. In the days that followed, the office felt different. Not hostile. Watchful. People adjusted their language around me. Requests came with context. Decisions were documented. It was subtle, but the shift was unmistakable. The system was recalibrating. My sister kept her distance, communicating mostly through email. When we did speak, it was clipped and professional. It hurt, but it also clarified something I had been avoiding. Our closeness had always been conditional. It thrived when I supported her vision without asking for space of my own. One evening, after most people had left, I found my mother sitting alone in the conference room, papers spread out like she was studying for an exam. She looked up as I passed. "Sit with me," she said. I did. We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the building filling the gaps. "I did not plan for it to get this far," she said eventually. I believed her. I also knew intention did not erase impact. "I thought if I kept things informal," she continued, "we would stay close." I chose my words carefully. Informal works when power is balanced. She nodded, eyes fixed on the papers. "I am learning that." She looked at me then. Really looked. "You were always so capable. I thought you were fine." I felt the old urge to reassure, to say it was okay, to smooth the moment. I resisted it gently. "I was capable," I said. "I was not fine." She swallowed. "I am sorry. It was not a perfect apology. It did not untangle everything. But it landed. I let it." The final negotiation meeting happened the following week. Lawyers present. Accountant present. My mother at the head of the table. My sister sat rigidly to one side, arms folded, eyes sharp. I sat opposite her, notes organized, voice steady. We went through the document line by line. Language was refined, boundaries were clarified, numbers were adjusted slightly, upward, then locked. Authority was confirmed in writing. Review dates were set. Transparency measures were codified. When it was over, the lawyer slid the final draft across the table toward me. "Ready when you are." I did not sign immediately. I read the title again. I checked the clauses that mattered most. Then I picked up the pen and signed. The room exhaled. My sister did not look at me. My mother closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "It is done," she said. It was not done. Not emotionally, not relationally, but structurally, yes. The foundation had shifted. In the weeks that followed, the changes rippled outward. Meetings ran differently. Decisions flowed through clearer channels. Staff seemed more relaxed, less confused about who to ask and when. The partner engagement moved forward smoothly, anchored by the systems I had built and now officially led. There were moments of friction. My sister bristled when decisions did not automatically route through her. My mother caught herself defaulting to old habits and corrected course. I did the same, resisting the urge to overextend, to prove my worth again. One afternoon, a junior manager stopped by my office. She looked nervous. "I just wanted to say," she said, "things make more sense now. Thank you." I smiled. That mattered more than I expected. At home, the nights were quieter. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a hollow ache where constant vigilance used to live. I grieved the version of family I had hoped we could be without hard conversations. I also felt a growing respect for myself, a steadiness that did not require applause. My sister and I spoke less. When we did, it was cautious, like learning a new language together. Sometimes I wondered if the distance would ever close. Sometimes I knew it might not, and that had to be okay. One evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Lena. "Heard things changed. Proud of you." I smiled at the screen and typed back a simple thank you. As the quarter closed, I prepared a report for the board, my name listed clearly at the top. The numbers told a story of stability and growth, but the real change was harder to quantify. Fewer fires, more foresight, less chaos hidden by goodwill. On a Friday afternoon, as I packed up to leave, my mother stopped by my office. "We are having dinner on Sunday," she said. "Just family. No agendas." I hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." She smiled, tentative but hopeful. "I am glad you stayed." I met her gaze. "I am glad I stayed on my terms." She accepted that. That night, walking to my car, I felt the weight of the months lift slightly. The confrontation was behind us. The consequences were still unfolding. I did not know what our relationships would look like a year from now. I did know that I had chosen clarity over comfort, and that choice had already changed everything. As I drove home, the city lights blurred into long lines, and I realized something quietly profound. Revenge did not look like destruction. It looked like structure. It looked like refusing to be erased, and it looked like building a future where my work, my time, and my voice were no longer negotiable. The Sunday dinner arrived quietly, without the drama I had braced myself for, and that almost made it harder. My mother cooked, the way she always had when she wanted things to feel normal. The familiar smells filled the house, comforting and unsettling at the same time. I stood at the sink drying dishes before we sat down, watching her movements, how she avoided looking at me for too long, how she checked her phone more than usual. My sister arrived last. She kissed my mother cheek, nodded at me, and went straight to pouring herself a glass of wine. No sarcasm, no sharp remarks. Just distance. We ate with polite conversation, talking about weather, neighbors, a distant cousin wedding. It felt like a performance we all knew too well. Halfway through the meal, my mother set her fork down. "I want to say something," she said, her voice careful. My sister stiffened. I felt my shoulders tense, then forced them to relax. "I know the last few months have been difficult," my mother continued. "For all of us. I made decisions I thought were right at the time. Some of them hurt people I love. I am trying to understand that." She looked at me then. Really looked. Not as the reliable one, not as the helper, but as her daughter. "I should have listened sooner," she said. "I am sorry it took a contract and lawyers for me to see what was already there." The words settled into the space between us. I did not rush to forgive or soften them. I let them exist. My sister laughed quietly, swirling her wine. "This is where we pretend everything is fixed now." My mother turned to her. "It is not fixed, but it is honest." My sister looked at me. "You happy now?" I answered honestly. I am calmer. She snorted. That is not the same thing. No, I said. But it matters more. The rest of the dinner passed without resolution, but without explosions. That alone felt like progress. When I left, my mother hugged me tightly, lingering longer than usual. My sister hugged me too, briefly, her body stiff. As I drove home, I felt the familiar ache of wanting something more, something warmer, and the quieter acceptance that I might not get it. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of normal and new. At work, my role settled into place with less friction than I expected. People adjusted quickly when expectations were clear. Meetings had agendas. Decisions had owners. When something went wrong, it was addressed directly instead of being absorbed silently by whoever cared the most. That used to be me. I still cared. But the caring had boundaries now. I left on time more often. I took a full lunch break. I said no when something was outside my scope, and I said yes when it aligned with it. The world did not collapse. In fact, it ran more smoothly. One afternoon, my sister asked to meet. Not in an office, but at a coffee shop near work. Neutral territory again. She arrived early, tapping her fingers against her cup. I do not know how to talk to you anymore, she said, without preamble. I sat across from her. We can start with the truth. She sighed. The truth is, I feel like I lost something. Like you changed the rules mid-game. I considered that. I did not change them. I named them. She looked down. I thought you were fine. You always seemed fine. I felt a familiar tightness, then let it go. Being fine was never the same as being valued. She was quiet for a long moment. I did not realize how much you did until you stopped filling the gaps. That was the closest she came to acknowledgement. I accepted it. I did not want to hurt you, she said finally. I know, I replied. But not wanting to hurt someone does not mean you are not benefiting from their silence. She nodded slowly. We sat there, not reconciled, but less brittle. When we left, she hugged me, tentative, but real. It was something. At home, the quiet felt different too. Without the constant hum of resentment, there was space. I started sleeping better. I picked up small routines I had abandoned. Morning walks, cooking meals that were not rushed, reading before bed. Sometimes, doubt crept in late at night. Had I gone too far? Had I damaged something that could not be repaired? Those thoughts came less often now, and when they did, I met them with facts instead of fear. I had not asked for anything unreasonable. I had asked for clarity and fairness. The cost of asking had been discomfort, not destruction. One evening, Lena stopped by my office unannounced. She smiled when she saw the nameplate on my door, the one that finally reflected my role. Looks good on you, she said. I laughed softly. It still feels strange. She leaned against the doorframe. Strange is better than invisible. We talked for a few minutes, catching up. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the revenge is not in what you take away. It is in what you refuse to keep carrying. As the year moved toward its end, the business hit milestones my mother used to dream about. The partner deal closed. Systems scaled. Stress points surfaced early instead of exploding later. My mother started delegating more thoughtfully. My sister found her footing again, recalibrating her role with less certainty but more respect for the structure. Our family gatherings remained cautious. There were moments of warmth, moments of tension, moments where old habits threatened to resurface. Each time I chose differently. I did not smooth. I did not swallow. I did not perform gratitude for scraps. One night, after a long day, I sat on my couch and thought about the girl I had been at the beginning of all this. The one who believed love meant endurance. Who believed family drama was something to survive quietly. who believed revenge had to be loud to be real. I understood now that revenge can be quiet. It can look like growth, like boundaries, like refusing to disappear. My mother called me later that night. Just to check in, she said. No agenda. We talked about small things. At the end, she said, I am proud of you. It did not erase the past. It did not fix everything. But it mattered. As I hung up, I felt a sense of closure I had not expected to find. Not because everyone had changed completely, but because I had. I no longer needed their approval to justify my worth. I had built something solid enough to stand on its own. The story was not over. Families are not problems you solve once and move on from. They are systems you navigate, again and again. But I knew now how I would navigate mine, with clarity, with boundaries, and with the quiet confidence of someone who finally stopped working for free, in every sense of the word. I thought the hardest part would be the confrontation, the meetings, the contracts, the moment where everything finally had to be said out loud. I was wrong. The hardest part came afterward, when there was no more adrenaline to carry me forward, when I had to live inside the change I had fought for. It crept up on me slowly in ordinary moments, like the first time I left work exactly at the end of the day and did not feel the urge to check my email in the parking lot. Or the first weekend I spent entirely offline, not because I was proving a point, but because no one expected me to be available. Those moments felt almost unsettling at first, like wearing a coat that fit properly after years of adjusting yourself to something too small. At the office, the structure held. That surprised me more than anything. I had spent so long believing that everything would fall apart if I stopped absorbing the cracks. Instead, the opposite happened. When responsibilities were clearly assigned, people stepped up. When decisions had names attached to them, confusion faded. When I stopped rescuing everyone from discomfort, they learned how to manage it themselves. My mother struggled in quieter ways. She no longer argued or dismissed, but I could see the reckoning happening behind her eyes. Years of decisions she had justified as necessary were being re-examined through a new lens. Sometimes she apologized awkwardly, in half sentences and sighs. Sometimes she went silent instead. I learned not to chase either. Growth does not follow a script. One evening, she asked me to walk with her around the block after dinner. The street was calm, porch lights glowing, the sound of someone's television drifting through an open window. I used to think being a good mother meant keeping everything running, she said, even if it meant asking you to give more. I listened, my hands tucked into my coat pockets. I thought if I acknowledged how much you did, I would have to face how unfair it was, she continued, and I did not think I could afford to do that. I stopped walking and looked at her. That was the first time she had admitted it so plainly. I know, I said. She nodded, eyes shining but steady. I am trying to do better now. I believed her. Not because she had become a different person overnight, but because she was no longer pretending nothing needed to change. My sister's adjustment was sharper. She had always defined herself by success, visibility, control. Losing the ability to quietly rely on me without credit or permission felt like a personal loss to her. For a while, she treated me like an obstacle instead of a sister. Then came the day she failed publicly. It was a presentation she led without looping me in early enough. A partner asked detailed operational questions she could not answer. She stumbled, deflected, promised follow-up. I watched from the side of the room, heart pounding, knowing I could have stepped in at any moment. I did not. Afterward, she found me in the hallway, her face flushed. "You could have helped me?" she snapped. I met her gaze calmly. "You did not ask." The words landed harder than any accusation. She stared at me, then looked away. Later that night, she called. That was humiliating, she said. I softened my voice, but not my truth. It is what happens when people confuse visibility with substance. There was a long pause. Then she said something I never expected to hear. I never learned how to do the parts you do. I sat down on my couch, the weight of that admission settling in. I know, I said gently. That is why it mattered that it was recognized. She did not apologize. She did not need to. That conversation marked a shift. After that, she involved me earlier. She asked instead of assumed. Our relationship did not return to what it had been, but it became something more honest. Outside of work and family, my life began to stretch into spaces I had neglected for years. I reconnected with hobbies that had nothing to do with being useful. I spent time with people who knew me without needing anything from me. I learned how much of my identity had been wrapped around being indispensable and how freeing it was to loosen that grip. There were still moments of doubt. Late nights when I replayed conversations, wondering if I had been too firm, too demanding, too cold. Those thoughts always led me back to the same memory. My mother saying family works for free, the certainty in her voice, the ease with which my effort had been dismissed. That sentence had once made me feel small. Now it reminded me why I had done all of this. One afternoon, months later, a younger employee came into my office and asked for advice, not about a task, about a boundary. She said she was worried about being seen as difficult if she said no to something outside her role. I told her the truth, that being respected sometimes costs you approval. That approval without respect is not safety. That clarity protects everyone, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. She thanked me and left, shoulders a little straighter. I sat there for a long time afterward, realizing that the impact of my choice was rippling outward in ways I had never planned. Family gatherings became easier, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer pretended. I showed up as myself. I spoke when something mattered. I let silence exist when it needed to. I stopped managing everyone else's emotions as if they were my responsibility. On my birthday, my sister gave me a card. Inside, she wrote that she admired my courage, even when it made things harder for her. It was not poetic. It was real. I cried in my car afterward, not from sadness, but from the release of something old and heavy finally loosening its hold. Looking back now, I understand that what I did was not rebellion, it was correction. I corrected a story that said my worth was measured by how much I gave without question. I corrected a dynamic that confused love with obligation. I corrected myself. The truth is, I did not get everything I deserved. No one ever does. But I got enough to stand upright, enough to breathe, enough to stop disappearing. If you are listening to this and you feel that familiar ache of being the reliable one, the strong one, the one who never asks for anything, I want you to pause. Ask yourself who benefits from that story. Ask yourself what it has cost you. You do not have to burn bridges to reclaim your dignity. You do not have to punish anyone to choose yourself. Sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is simply refusing to keep paying a price you never agreed to. If this story stirred something in you, I hope you will share it. Leave a comment and tell me what sentence finally opened your eyes, the moment you realized you were being asked to give more than was fair. And if you want to stay for more stories about justice, boundaries, and the quiet strength it takes to stop working for free, stay here with me. Subscribe, and let us keep telling the truth together.